thesis at university. I ended up doing a PhD thesis on the subject at University College London, and then turned it into a book. So this is my major book, Blood Relations. And if you look at the subtitle, Menstruation and the Origins of Culture. I'm not going to go into it all here, but nobody previously had ever thought that, well, I mean, pretty much nobody had even thought that women had anything to do with human origins. But as for menstruation being a sort of critical factor, that was absolutely unheard of, really. And I won't go into why I came to that conclusion, but simply, very, very briefly, simply say that for humans, we all have in all hunter-gatherer societies, other societies, all of us have some kind of religion around the world. I don't necessarily like the term religion, because hunter-gatherers don't have gods that control things and dominate them. They have the trickster, and they're much more happy and jokey about their divinities. But across the world, there's always this idea, which I think is a very lovely, essential feature of all the world's religions, which is that some things are sacred. Not everything has a price. And as soon as you look into that idea that some things are sacred, you realize that the idea of sacredness is intimately connected with the idea of taboo. Things are taboo when they are sacred. And so often, as is pointed out a long time ago by Emil Durkheim and various other major figures in the study of the origins of religion, and it quickly became clear to me that the most taboo thing of all is blood, and particularly menstrual blood. Just leaving all that aside for the moment, just simply say that all the standard narratives of human origins from Darwin onwards, and even today actually, are about man. Man the hunter, man the toolmaker, man the thinker, man this, man that. And it's all about men. And of course, the excuse which has been used all these years is that, and I sort of agree with this idea, there are certain things that women aren't very good at. And I think that's absolutely right. There are certain things that women aren't very good at. And one of those things is violence. I think if the world was run by violence, if violence was what mattered, men would be better at that than women. I mean, obviously women can have guns and knives, swords and stuff and weapons, and women with weapons against an unarmed man would probably win. But in biological terms, the male is better at violence than the female. And from that, it sort of stands to reason, really. If human social life has always been one in which violence counted, in other words, at the end of the day, when decisions are made, they're made through threat and violence, then there's not much question males will tend to rule over females. And actually, in the case of our closest primate relatives, the chimpanzees, I'm now talking about common chimpanzees, the kind of chimpanzees which we've known about for a long time, that Jane Goodall and Richard Wrangham and others studied. There's quite a lot of truth in the idea that might is right for those close relatives of ours. I mean, all common chimpanzees are very competitive. The males fight each other. Every male dominates every female, at least in the area where Jane Goodall did her field research at the Gombe stream. So if it were true that humans evolved with our capacities and our I don't know, skills and accomplishments, for example, language, if we also developed a social system where violence was a fundamental ultimate principle, then it would be kind of a no-brainer. Males have always dominated society. It doesn't matter how much you want to sort of change things. You can't really change human nature. If human nature is kind of pictured for us by chimpanzee nature, then male dominance is natural. And so therefore, it was absolutely brilliant when primatologists began to discover our equally close chimpanzee relatives, the bonobos. This is an absolute must-read book for anybody, I would say. Bonobos, Unique in Mind, Brain and Behavior by Brian Hare and Shinya Yamamoto. Because these are chimpanzees who are biologically almost identical, certainly genetically pretty much identical to common chimpanzees. They've only diverged from common chimpanzees a million years ago. And guess what? They are matriarchal, and not just matriarchal, but actually, in this book, it's explained the most effective Darwinian theory to explain what goes on in bonobo societies is called the offspring defense hypothesis, which means that little toddlers are the ruling caste. And the little toddlers are able to just cry a little bit, make a bit of a noise, and they'll scare the biggest male away. The reason being that every little toddler is carefully watched by its mum, and all around her are her allies, and they will just beat up any male who threatens their kid. And so therefore, the idea that we have male dominance because of our genes is it's completely collapsed. It doesn't make any sense whatever. And I'll, if you like, later on we can discuss what it is exactly about the environment that bonobos entered, which led to this complete, almost like a revolution, at any rate, a turning upside down of male dominance, resulting in little babies being pretty much, the privileged part of society and having more power in many respects than males. Right. That's it for now. Okay. Otherwise I'll go on for an hour or so.
Okay, thanks. Did anyone have any questions after Chris? Might be a good idea if anybody felt like asking anything. If not, Peter.
Hi, just very quickly, this seems to bring up the question of a distinction between cultural and natural selection. In my conversations with Bob Pollock at Columbia last year, he suggested that we should use the term cultural selection. And he pointed out that ideas can change things much faster than a generation. So, yeah.
Well, it so happens that cultural transmission in great apes, but let's stick to chimpanzees, is fundamentally dependent on the mother-offspring bond. So chimpanzee young learn from their mum. They don't really learn from dad. I mean, you can go into why. So there's no question that cultural transmission goes much faster than genetic change. But we need to look at the social, if you like, the gender dynamics, which enables cultural transmission, and in particular enables what we call the ratchet effect. In other words, this situation with humans where cultural innovations are not just sort of invented and then forgotten, but actually accumulate. So you get an accumulation of cult repertoire. So, I mean, there's no question that you're right there. But as I say, to me, that's a very basic observation, but it's still a bit of a mystery unless we have a theory to explain how it is that cultural transmission took off in the way it did with humans. And what I'm arguing is that male dominance wouldn't have facilitated that, because offspring learn from mum, and in the human case, at a certain point in evolution, the female, instead of moving out on reaching sexual maturity and having to live in an area where she hadn't got any kin and in particular hadn't got her own mum, in our case, evolution led to the female of the species living with mum down the generations, living with mum, living with mum, living with mum, and reasons for that, and reasons why certain obstacles to that had to be overcome. But I'm just simply saying that cultural transmission and cultural selection in turn depend on sort of more basic factors, and those have to do with sex and reproduction and production, sex and food.
But you would agree that it's a selective process that competes with and possibly supersedes the natural selective process? Like humans have been driving their own bus.
Yes, of course. Yeah, of course.
But Peter, we also need to ask the question, when does that really start to happen? And I think Chris is right to say that gender politics is going to make a lot of difference to the answer to that. Plus also, I'm not sure that we ever quite throw natural or sexual selection out the window. Mark, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. If I'm correct in my memory and understanding of the readings and other things I've read, chimpanzee mothers keep their babies very close to them because of threats of others around them.
Yeah.
But and of course, humans, as Sarah Hrdy has explored, very much involve others in mothering. Are bonobos in between in their behaviors, or are they more like chimps in the mother alone raising the child, the offspring?
They're a little bit in between, but basically female bonobos don't trust others really to carry their baby.
They're living with non-related females. And I think that is the critical bit, that if their other females are not their relatives, they're not, despite the fact they do make strong bonds, they're still not raising each other's children.
So both of these great ape relatives of ours, the common chimps and the pygmy chimps or bonobos, the mothers are single mums. And that means a huge constraint on the kind of brain those babies are going to be born with, because as soon as you start getting a large brain baby, it's very demanding, and very quickly you reach what's called the gray ceiling of something like, I don't know, 650 cc or something, whereupon no single mum can possibly cope. And so unless she is living with her mum and getting support from her mum, and also that would, of course, if you are living with your mum as a female, you'd be living with your sisters, unless you do get what Sarah Hrdy calls this shared childcare, then brain size won't increase. And the fact that we've got these very large brains proves actually that we must have been living with mum. We must have been having support from the grandmother. That's the grandmother effect, and that would have lifted the lid off brain size. We'd have broken through the grey ceiling.
Shall I do some little slides on that?
What a brilliant idea.
To give a little bit of substance to it for anybody who's not, I mean, we've had in the reading links that we sent out, just to say that we sent out a link for a Google Drive version of Chris's book. And I can't emphasize too much what a classic Blood Relations is for anybody wanting to look at these narratives of human evolution, which tended also always to focus on man the hunter. And really, Chris did a quite revolutionary turn to focus on female strategies as very critical. And again, this century, Sarah Hrdy's book has been absolutely overturned the field and created this huge feminist turn, along with the grandmother hypothesis. And the other reading, I mean, this is the critical issue. We're trying to explore matriarchy versus patriarchy, which is kind of extreme statements of different, one sex or the other taking over. But what I would like to, my piece that was, we sent the links out, was about gender egalitarianism. And I'd just like to quickly run down the evidence, if you like, that our ancestors, in terms of genus Homo, and the more that we come close to the present in the last million years, particularly since Homo erectus with the large-brained humans, that these ancestors were living in increasingly egalitarian contexts. And I think there's very strong evidence, because there's a whole set of features of our anatomy, our psychology, our life history, which basically, I'm just going to share screen for this. They basically would not have evolved without having an egalitarian social context. That means that if they're being, can people see?
I can see one line which says egalitarian features.
I'm gonna take it. So the egalitarian features are if there had been significant male dominance in human evolution, it's very hard to understand how we would have got the bodies and the brains that we got. So let's just start with one of the features. Oh, there we are. One of the features we talked about last time, which is cooperative eyes, the elongated shape of our eyes with the white sclera background, which is something that all humans everywhere, it's an item of fixation in humans. And cooperative eyes are very much the scaffold for the psychological aspect of human species, of intersubjectivity, our ability to mutually mind read, to read each other's thoughts and understand our thoughts in terms of what other people think. And we are, with our eyes, we're very open for people to look at what are we thinking and to understand what are they thinking. These are features that really evolve, they go together. It's very hard to understand how these features would have evolved in societies with significant rank differentiation, dominance, submission, such as chimpanzees. Chimpanzees do not have cooperative eyes. They do not have intersubjectivity, nor do bonobos. We read last time Michael Tomasello's piece. Chimpanzees are very interested in understanding what other individuals are thinking, but they're not interested in letting other individuals know what they themselves, that individual's thinking. So they're not meshing mental states. They're not empathizing to that extent that they let each other know what they feel. Other aspects, our psychology is extremely what's been termed counter-dominant. And this is particularly a terminology that's been used about hunter-gatherers, that hunter-gatherer societies, egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, people resent anyone trying to tell them what to do. They resent being, in any way coerced or exploited. And it's been described as counter-dominance, that there's a kind of agreement. One individual is agreeing, I won't dominate you if you don't try and dominate me. And that ends up with a rough egalitarianism. And again, if we think about chimpanzees, really there isn't, chimpanzees may not like to be dominated, but there's a lot that dominance submission and the ritualized features of dominance submission kind of keep the wheels of chimpanzee society. I think it goes against the grain for humans more than it does for chimps. And these two features are about Chris was talking about allomothering, collective childcare. As we said with the great apes, like chimps and bonobos, mothers hold on to their own babies. They don't hand them over. They don't let other individuals look after their babies. This is not true with monkeys. Monkeys are quite at ease with letting other individuals look after their babies. And at the root of that is probably the fact that most old world monkeys have female kin relations. They live with female kin. So it's a very significant aspect. And that implies, as Chris was saying, that there's probably a history in genus Homo of female kin residence, which would have facilitated being able to hand over a baby to another female who is probably a relative. So the whole grandmother hypothesis would go along with that, with who would be, for allomothering, who would be the best support for a female in the first place would be her mother. That's the most reliable candidate to help her. So the grandmother hypothesis, likely living with mum. And as Chris suggested, that is what would have enabled going through what he talked about, the gray ceiling. I'll show you the brain size and how that changes through evolution. That really is the story of human evolution. That enormous brain expansion. It is 2, 3, and more than 3 times chimpanzee brain volumes. The other aspect that we can talk about in respect of egalitarian features that, you know, they seem to have evolved to distribute chances of mating over a much wider pool of males than simply 1 or 2 dominant males. So this is evidence in women's bodies of their sexual physiology. And we just mention a couple of aspects there. Concealment of ovulation, so that really men or males are just not very well aware of exactly when a female is actually near ovulation or fertile, where women are concerned, Homo sapiens. This is quite different and distinct from chimpanzees or bonobos who have large estrus signals. Bonobos tend to have rather continuous estrus signals, whereas chimps have much more demarcated estrus signals. But those signals act as, they can inform the dominant male just exactly when a female is really fertile. With our concealed ovulation, males just don't know. And in addition to concealed ovulation, we have receptivity that can go almost all around the cycle. That is, being able to have sex almost all around the cycle or not have sex, deciding either way. So-called continuous receptivity. Of course, bonobos are famous also for a lot of sexual activity, but even bonobos do not have so much of their cycle as we have available for sex. I've mentioned synchrony there, and I'll show you the principle of synchrony, because again, reproductive synchrony means that more males are involved in the mating system. So it is supporting egalitarianism in the sense that it undermines dominant males. That slogan, "One woman, one penis," comes from Bayaka hunter-gatherer women, which they use as a kind of chant. They're dancing, they're chanting, they want one woman should have one penis. If men are useful, everyone should have one at least. What they're saying is they do not want to be in anyone's harem. They don't want to be like 2 wives for 1 hunter. This is not what they want. And I'm just going to go ahead to show how synchrony in cycles, that would be, we sometimes think of menstrual synchrony, but if we think of ovulatory synchrony, synchronizing fertility cycles, this is actually what it does. I'm just going to jump ahead. That's the simple principle of synchrony. If you have females as kind of clocks there, and females are at different phases, then if one male is a bit dominant, he can pick them off one by one. But as soon as the females synchronize, he can't do that. And suddenly all these other males come in the system. So this is very egalitarian. It's egalitarian in terms of spreading reproductive success among a number of males there. Okay, it's not going to work exactly like clockwork, but the more that females tend to synchronize, the more males should come in the system. And this is well known amongst primates. It's not a mystery. Just briefly to have a look at the brain expansion, because this is the gray ceiling that Chris was referring to here. We're looking at a chart of, which is really the story of human evolution of the 3 million years, with these different levels of brain expansion, starting off with, these are fossil specimens for Australopithecine species, with roughly similar volumes. This is the brain size, the actual brain volume here on this axis, roughly similar to chimpanzees or maybe gorillas, great ape. And yeah, what that's representing is that those specimens, those species were basically single mums doing all the work. Mums raising these very large brains, you know, any great ape has a large brain, and the mothers are producing all the energy requirements for raising that large brained offspring. She's doing it all by herself. Chimps do, bonobos do, gorillas do, Australopithecines. On the evidence of this, it looks like it. Come down after 2 million years, and suddenly our ancestors, becoming Homo erectus, smash through. They smash through that gray ceiling. So this is telling us this is something revolutionary. It's a huge shift, and it's telling us that mothers were no longer alone. Mothers had others supporting them. And that is a characteristic for Homo erectus. That is the basis of kind of Sarah Hrdy's arguments about cooperative breeding, and what she describes as the onset of intersubjectivity, mutual mind reading. But then we come down after a period which is kind of roughly similar, a bit above 2 times chimp brain size. And inside this last period of 500, 700, 800,000 years, the very large-brained humans, Neanderthals, ourselves, their ancestors, accelerated past 3 times chimp volume to these very high brain sizes. So something happened there for mothers to enable them to have the energy to go through, to raise offspring. That it's like the lid comes off the energy available. Okay, so yeah, I've mentioned, whoops. I've mentioned the grandmother hypothesis with and Sarah Hrdy's mothers and others there. What we suggest is that gender politics, we talked about reproductive synchrony as an aspect of egalitarianism. What we'd suggest is gender politics must be very critical in enlisting increased levels of male support for the mothers, if in the first place, grandmother and female relatives were the initial supporting structure for the mothers with Homo erectus. With the later stage of Homo sapiens ancestry, we're talking about males getting seriously involved, seriously supporting female reproduction and producing a lot of energy for mothers that enable them to have these very large-brained offspring. This is, again, just as smashing through the gray ceiling would be a revolutionary aspect of human evolution, this is, again, a completely revolutionary transition. Male chimps hunt. They're mostly male chimps that hunt. Female bonobos may do a certain amount of hunting, but it's not a lot. But male chimps don't provide meat to females. Females, if they want to get any part of the meat of these little monkeys that these male chimps are hunting, have to run after. They've got to run after, and a female who's carrying an offspring, she's not going to be the first one there. It's not going to help her. So female chimps are well known for using tools to get proteins and fats like termite fishing, nut cracking, and so forth. That is like their sources of proteins and fats, of high energy foods that will support their reproduction. But if you look at the difference here, this is an absolutely radical difference with hunters. These are Central Kalahari hunter-gatherers bringing a large game animal, Hemsbok, all the way back across the desert to the camp where women, children, older people are waiting and going to be able to eat the food that then gets distributed. So this is a complete and utter change. It's a huge revolutionary step. How did that happen? How did females, what was the strategies of females in creating that situation is part of the question that Chris in Blood Relations and myself and Ian have been working on for a long time in our researches. And we think there's a model that really explains what happened inside the last 500,000 years. So this is highlighting why menstruation matters so much. if you take out, if you conceal ovulation, any male who wants to track a female's fertility, he doesn't have much, he doesn't have that signal. So he can't track female fertility in the way that a male chimp can track a female estrus signal. But there is still a big signal left that is indicative about fertility in the near future, and that is menstruation. So if you have a coalition of females who might be relatives or friends, and one of them is menstruating whilst the other's lactating and pregnant and so on, the males are going to know that this is potentially a female who's going to be fertile, and she'll become a target, which creates a lot of conflict amongst the males and creates a lot of conflict amongst the females too. Those females are probably her relatives. They're going to want to protect her and make sure that no male here who's a bit dominant, who wants to try and get hold of that female, take her off on safari, sequester her. So they're going to want to protect her. But what we think the answer was for females when this situation arose, and as that brain size was going up and up and up with our ancestry, with our ancestors in Africa, is that females decided to collectively appropriate the signal of menstruation and create that as a, Chris has talked about the aspect of sacred, the aspect of taboo, create that as a signal no, which is then intended to tell the males there, you're not coming anywhere near us until you've gone away and done some hunting. This is actually very egalitarian from a point of view of not just the females, but also from the point of view of the males, because this signal, when the females are making a kind of line, a picket line, if you like, saying no by joining this menstrual signal with cosmetics to say we're taboo, it cuts out any male who's a dominant male who wants to try and track female fertility, find a fertile female, and then move on. A dominant male who's not going to do the work. This is kind of a process of, it's cultural process, but it's also a sexual selection process. It means the females are choosing males who work, and the males who work are choosing cosmetically decorated females, because those females cut out the dominant males. Okay, I think I've said enough now. And Helen, you had I'm going to stop sharing until we hand over to Ian to say some more, but Helen and anybody else would like to ask some questions.
Yeah, so I am curious about the transition that happened. So we have bonobos who are these female dominant, if you want to put it that way, societies where the needs of females and the children are coming to play quite a bit. But then despite that, we still see the situation where the females are not quite willing to do collective childcare. And has there been any exploration of why that is the case? That's first question. But also wondering if, having talked about the female cosmetic coalitions, we might want to have Chris talk a bit more about the matriarchy myths, because the strategies that women use to create these coalitions were part of what, if I remember these myths correctly, was part of what was disrupted when men in the society started to understand these strategies and co-opt some of these practices and have symbolic menstruation. So maybe we could explore some of the myths and have Chris talk to us about that some more. So first a question and then a suggestion.
Well, just a very brief comment. That is the key question, Helen. It's absolutely the key question. If our bonobo great ape relatives have got such matriarchy, why didn't they go the whole way? It's very difficult for female great apes like chimpanzees to establish this pattern that we did, which is to stay with mum when you're having sex. In other words, when you reach maturity and you're going to start getting pregnant, to stay with mum. And the reason why chimpanzee females move out And actually why bonobo females move out is to get the hell out of the way of their older brothers and fathers who keep hassling them for sex. So with chimpanzees, there's absolutely no incest taboo. I mean, you know, the males want sex with, you know, anything that moves kind of thing. And the females absolutely don't. But the way that the chimpanzee female will make sure she's not hassled by male relatives who are dominant over her is to just get the hell out of there, even though there's a big cost because she's now going to be living in a locality where she doesn't have kin. And that side of things, the bonobos share. So, I mean, obviously, there's a huge lot of things we can say, but in a nutshell, the bonobo female strategy is lots and lots and lots of sex. And the human female strategy was not lots and lots and lots and lots of sex. It was lots and lots of sex, but be very careful about who you're having sex with and make sure that you remember no is just as important as yes. So human females developed a collective no sex strategy around menstruation, and bonobos don't really have a no strategy, except of course that you know the body of a bonobo or a chimp kind of signals no anyway, but in the sense that sex is only possible when you've got a swelling. So there are some periods when the bonobos, you know, just simply because sex is impossible physically, aren't having sex. But in the human case, because we didn't even have that, the evolving human female was continuously sexually receptive, of course, in principle. That meant she needed a collective conscious way of signaling no against rape. But there's a lot of things involved in that, and anyway, the human female went in a sort of middle of the road direction where no, some things are sacred, namely our bodies when we don't feel like it, was just as important as yes.
Right. Has that answered question there? Because there's some other questions in the chat as well. Did anybody want to ask more?
And Alicia, I don't know if you want to come on screen to ask your question, or I can read it out. It's about women naturally synchronizing menstruation.
So,
a big, huge book on all that.
yeah, but to be a little up to date.
Yeah, well,
I mean, do you want to go, Chris, or shall I? Do you want to go?
Well, I mean, all right. So let's talk about periodicity. We evolved in Africa, and one of the reasons why we were even social at all, because living in a group has got benefits, of course, but it's got cost as well. Why did evolving humans live in increasingly large groups? It's actually for safety in numbers. So when you're living clumped together, you can be more safe against the dangerous predators around, and the big cats like today's lions, except that they're even bigger types of big cats. They are completely lunar. A lot of people don't realize that lions are lunar. When I say lunar, what I mean is they're lazy and they don't like chasing after you at a great speed. And they like to just pounce on an animal, including a human, in the dark because they've got brilliant night vision. And so during the course of human evolution, we humans have got hopeless night vision. Lions have got brilliant night vision. And so we would have been aggregating for safety in numbers every dark moon when we couldn't see at night, and then dispersing more easily around full moon. And the human female menstrual cycle adapted to that lunar rhythm. So a lot of people just think that chimpanzees and bonobos and other great apes have a menstrual cycle. Well, they kind of do, but you shouldn't really call it menstrual because the word menstruation means moon change. And bonobos have a 40-day cycle, which has got nothing at all to do with the moon. And chimpanzees have a 36-day cycle, nothing at all to do with the moon. The one great ape, which has got exactly the length of cycle you would predict if synchronizing with each other, using the moon as a clock, were adaptive in the evolutionary past, is the human female, whose average menstrual cycle length is 29.5 days, exactly the length that the moon takes to go through its phases as seen from the Earth. There's another primate, the orangutan, which is very, very close, 29 days. And it's very likely that that's again to do with the moon, because the orang females live up in the trees, the males are often too heavy and can't be in the trees quite the way the females are. But all I'm saying is that, yes, the question is exactly right. In my own view, there's not a shadow of doubt in the evolutionary past, human females synchronize with each other as part of their solidarity and to distribute sexual opportunities among multiple males, as Camilla was explaining, any kind of reproductive synchrony will do that. And although that doesn't happen today, there's still some evidence that under some circumstances, human females who live together and work together and bond with each other may have a tendency to synchronize. The statistics are very unsure about all that, but I've got no doubt in my mind that one of the reasons why all of the world's hunter-gatherers and other indigenous people, one of the reasons why they always link menstruation with the moon is because in the evolutionary past, it was linked. There was a good reason why women would menstruate together up to a point. Obviously, obviously very few hunter-gatherer women would be menstruating at any one time. Most women would be pregnant and all those things.
Can I bust in? Can I bust in a bit, Chris?
Camille's very good at busting in on these things, and I'm now going to let her bust in. Yes.
Alicia was asking, don't we think it's the same for apes? Both chimps and bonobos have they do not have lunar length cycles, that's for sure. They probably, because of their estrous signals, their reproductive cycles are longer. But the key point in the model that I was showing is that males have a better signal for tracking fertility, which is the big estrous signal. So males aren't really interested in menstruation. And we don't tend to get ovulatory synchrony for chimps and bonobos. It's a bit unusual that there might be some overlapping and there might be seasonal effects, but it's not generally found. Though there are primates that have got reproductive synchrony significantly. But in the model that I was showing, obviously for human women today and for our ancestors in the past, interbirth intervals, maybe 4 years, chimpanzee interbirth intervals between one baby and the next, as 5 years, 3 to 4 years would be quite normal for hunter-gatherers. So what you're not going to have is all women menstruating together like clockwork, because some will be pregnant, some will be first-year breastfeeding, some will be coming up to weaning before they start menstruating again. And as Chris says, hunter-gatherer women do not have anything like as many periods as women in Western lifestyles, because they're doing a lot of breastfeeding and they start having children earlier generally than women in Western lifestyles. But what that means is when menstruation happens, it's very significant. It's very significant for pointing to the likelihood of fertility. And for most hunter-gatherer cultures, menstruation has this very significant aspect of fertility and power as associated to that culturally. So that's why we're kind of focused on menstruation as a key signal. Are there any more questions? Because maybe it would be worth letting Ian have some more discussion on this. But does that clarify the question?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you.
It does. And Camilla, I was wondering if down the line, after we have Ian speak to the archaeological record, it might be worth revisiting the ways in which some of the men in some of these societies try to co-opt menstrual practices and signals, and what the implications of that.
I'm sure we're going to finish with the matriarchy stories.
Gotcha.
And Chris is going to come right to that. But let's try and work out the egalitarian origins first, because I mean, that perhaps the single feature of human cognition which actually says we must have had a prolonged phase of egalitarianism in our ancestry is language itself, our capacity for language. And we aren't going to maybe say too much about that today, because we've got a whole session for language and laughter right at the end of these series in June. But you know, this whole, what we call a symbolic cultural revolution, incorporated, of course, language and linguistic forms of communication. Do you want to take over a bit, Ian, on any of those aspects? Say something. I don't know. Hunter-gatherer fertility, or the archaeology of the pigments, or whatever.
Tell us who you are, Ian.
Yeah, let us know who you are, and I've got slides if you want them.
Right. Yes, I've been looking at what I consider to be the archaeological record relating to the evolution of collective ritual. And I think this is what we're talking about here. Is, if we can go back to Camilla's slides, we're talking about that second period of brain size increase. And I'm going to start off by just giving some archaeological background. Can you bring up that? Yes, we'll stop there.
Brain size increase, so from after 1 million years.
Yeah. So it's around with early Homo erectus that we start to see good evidence for meat eating, tool use in butchery, and as the graph is showing here, this breaking through the grey ceiling. That's not the only, the increase in brain size isn't the only thing that happens then. Also, there's an increase in body size, and that's more pronounced amongst females than it is amongst males. And one reason it's thought that happened is that to feed these larger brained offspring, females needed to be foraging over larger ranges. Now, so they're still reliant, not to the same degree as with Australopithecines, but they're still reliant, you know, very largely on their own foraging effort. Yes, we are seeing evidence for hunting, but critically, what we don't see in this period, for over 1.5 million years, we don't see any evidence for campsites. In fact, we don't see any evidence for any kind of signaling either, signaling behavior. So
Can you, Ian, clarify what you mean by signaling behavior? Maybe people,
well,
anything.
Anything other than stone tool use. I mean, you know, what I'll come on to talk about is the early use of red ochre. And I think that is really the beginning of well, there are two kinds of signaling that are happening late from around 500,000 years ago. One does relate to stone tools, but the main line of evidence relates to pigment use, but I'll come on to that shortly. The important point here is that the likelihood is that females are tagging along with males. Everyone is foraging together, moving across a landscape. They probably have protected sleeping sites, but they're not campsites. They're not places that people are bringing back resources and sharing them with others. So effectively, it would be a bit of a stretch to infer a recognizable sexual division of labor from the archaeology of this period. Now, around 1 million years ago, we begin to see a few changes. We find the first indications of controlled use of fire at just 1 or 2 sites, one called Wonderwert Cave in the interior of South Africa. But it is very patchy evidence. And yeah, this is like, it's a very wide cave, like a double railway tunnel that goes back 140 meters into the hill. But in these early periods of occupation, it's only the front of the cave that's used. This is going back about 2 million years. And the earliest evidence for controlled use of fire is going back 1 million years there. Now, a bit later, there's a site in Israel called Gesher Benot Yaakov at about 780,000, which is again providing good evidence for controlled use of fire. And this is more like a campsite. What a recent publication is showing that they were regularly cooking catfish. The site is beside a lake, and you know, they do. Originally, when it was first published 10 years ago or so, that it was exciting for the evidence of fire use. The evidence for the cooking of fish is just in the last year, I think. But it's again a sort of isolated instance. It's not until, well, in Europe and the Near East, it's not really until about 400,000 years ago that we begin to find consistent evidence for campsites. So if going back to the previous slide, the brain size increase one, is it the previous one?
It's a couple. Okay.
Right. So here we're talking about what in this graph at least looks like a sort of exponential period of increase, where we're increasing, brain sizes are increasing basically from around 1,000 cubic centimeters up to about 1,200, and then in the last period up to about 1,500 cubic centimeters. So, and this is over a relatively short period, just a few 100,000 years. Now, this is a shared pattern both between ourselves and Neanderthals and the recently discovered Denisovans in Central and Eastern Asia. So, and as I said, the evidence for campsites is also a shared trait amongst these different lineages. And there are a number of archaeological changes we're seeing here. First of all, evidence for...
Ja, nå sier VM. Kan vi sitte denne VM, okay?
Chris, can you mute all? Can you mute, please? And then I'll mute Ian.
Everyone's muted.
Okay, sorry. Right. Evidence for more systematic hunting of large animals, whether it's mass kills or the selective hunting of prime age adults, also begins to rapidly accumulate from about 400,000. And a major technological change as well. The end of, or the beginning of the end of hand axes and the beginning of points and blades, tools that could be potentially hafted. And perhaps most intriguingly, this is when we see the first evidence for pigment use between 500 and 300,000 years ago in Europe, in India, and in Africa. But even from very early on, there seems to be a bit of a difference between the African and the non-African records. In Europe, for that very early period, we just have one site. In India, we just have one site. In Southern Africa, we've got 3 or 4 sites associated with an industry called the forest-smith, which is transitional between the hand axes of the Acheulean and the Middle Stone Age with its points and blades. And this is also associated with the earliest evidence for hafted stone-tipped spears. And some of this evidence is coming again from that site I mentioned earlier with the early fire use, Wonderwerk Cave. But now, some of these pigments are coming right from the back of the cave, where it's so dark that you can only use it with firelight. So what we're inferring there is that this is evidence for some of the early group ritual display using bright red and brilliant pigments. So going back to what Camilla was outlining, the sort of sham what we used to dub a sham menstruation hypothesis. I can't hear you, Camilla.
Female cosmetic coalitions. Let's just
Okay.
keep it simple.
Now, which is basically, if one member of a residential coalition of females starts to menstruate, what do the other females do about it? Those females who are most reproductively burdened, they are, as Camilla was saying, either pregnant or breastfeeding, likely chances are. They are the ones who most need male investment, but the males are liable to be focusing on this female who's giving them reliable information that she will be fertile imminently. So the basic idea is that they started using artificial substitutes, sharing the blood around. And that what collective ritual is doing is like, it's a whole song and dance performance trying to get over a message that the males don't necessarily want to hear. So it's got to be quite a costly, convincing display. We're serious. Piss off and don't come back until you bring the bacon, essentially.
No cuddles, no zebra, no cuddles.
Yeah.
An easy way to say it.
Yeah.
Not bacon, really. It could be what? It could be warthog.
Or
it could be
warthog.
bush pig. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's tasty enough.
So
So
I've spent my sort of the last 30 years tracking the record of red pigment use in Africa. And it's initially very sporadic, then begins to pick up around 300,000 years ago. And about 25 years ago, we published a joint paper with Chris and Camilla predicting that there should be, we predict a shift from irregular use of red ochre to habitual use at around 160,000. And the reason we made that prediction was that there were two main reasons. One was that to do with the brain size story, that it had recently become apparent that it was, at the time they thought around 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens evolved in Africa. And that seems to have been when the brain size maximized. But a related reason was more ecological, to do with climate conditions, that within the tropics and subtropics, the period of scarcity is the late dry season. This is when there are very few vegetable foods left, the fruit is finished, there's little, if any, honey, and you become, and animal fat becomes more critical. So the pressures on these female coalitions to harness even greater levels of more reliable levels of male investment in the forms of collective big game hunting should really kick in in dry seasons in general, but dry seasons would be even more severe during glacial cycles. Now, our current understanding of our speciation is that it's a process spanning from at least 300,000 years ago up until about 150,000 years ago. And that through that process, brain size increasing continued. Also through that period, like best part of 200,000 years, the majority of the period it falls into two glacial cycles. And the second of those, between 190 and 130,000 years ago, was particularly severe and prolonged, and for the most part seems to have been fairly uniform in resulting in dry conditions across Africa. So dry season seasonality dry season scarcity of carbohydrates would be even more pronounced at this period, which is just when brain sizes had maximized. So this is when we're predicting that these female ritual cosmetic displays had to shift from a kind of context-dependent performance into a matter of habitual ritual. Now, when we first proposed that, we couldn't test it. There wasn't the evidence available in terms of well-dated sites. Just last year, a paper was published, but independently of us, doing a meta-analysis of the African ochre record. And they identified three main phases, sort of starting off, as I said, around 500,000 years ago, very sporadic finds, both in East Africa and Southern Africa. And then what they term an emergent phase, which basically spans our speciation. And then right at the end of our speciation, they identify a shift from irregular to habitual use at around 160,000.
Yep.
So it's not often that you get to make a prediction that which can't be tested at the time, and 25 years later, what do we find? It looks suspiciously like confirmation of that prediction. Now, the authors, may not agree with that interpretation, but at face value, that's what it looks like. Thereafter,
just to say, and they strongly agree with the interpretation that the ochre represents a ritual tradition.
yes, this is the main argument.
Strongly agree with that.
Yeah, and in fact, the power of their argument is precisely the point of convergence between social anthropology and evolutionary anthropology, which is the Durkheimian tradition about the importance of group ritual. They see it, they interpret the ochre record in terms of group ritual, and they see habitual group ritual as the basis of symbolic culture. That is to say, shared fictions, the ability to declare that some things are sacred, starting with our bodies, being able to say no. And it's out of that you can then you create your first gods, your menstrual taboos, your religions, if you like. And very shortly afterwards, at around 142,000, we get the earliest consensual evidence for symbolic culture in the form of shell beads in Morocco.
So the beads at Bismune.
Yeah. And then thereafter, from around 100,000 other lines of evidence, engravings on ochre, like this famous piece from Blombos Cave in South Africa that was published in 2002. And this engraving tradition, all the early lines of symbolic evidence relate to red ochre in one way or another, whether it's as residues on the beads, the substrate of the engravings, the earliest burials with grave goods, the paint in the paint palettes. We don't have a slide here of that, but like abalone shell palettes dating to 100,000, again from the same site, Blombos.
I think that's
so, and this is all before.
I'm going to stop the share and come out.
Yeah, okay, and this is all before some of our ancestors left Africa to colonize the rest of the world and eventually replace our sister lineages, but incorporating them within our genetic meta population. So we have Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA in population, non-African populations. But we would argue that they were carrying with them this hallmark of symbolic culture of habitual red ochred, body painted collective rituals. So
great, fantastic. Can I just put in a couple of questions before we open it up? Because there's this tradition, when we were writing in the 90s, there's this tradition about the human revolution, which in the 90s was talking about Europe But of course, we were trying to talk about what happened in Africa and with your work in Africa. And then in around 2000, 2001, whatever, McBrearty and Brooks attacked the idea of the human revolution with the revolution that wasn't, and said that there was a protracted process in Africa with all kinds of different things happening in different parts of Africa. And then very recently, there's been again an archaeological review from Skerry and Will, which is titled The Revolution That Still Isn't. So here we are, and we've recently published to defend the idea of a symbolic revolution, that humans had a symbolic revolution. So what is the position around that? Can we just say a little bit on that? Why is symbolism necessarily revolutionary?
Yes, this Skerry and Will paper is a very nice paper, but it's slippery. Basically, when they say they title their paper "The Revolution That Still Isn't," it's as if they're addressing questions about human origins, but the scope of their paper is coming right down to 30,000 years. It's not addressing speciation, and it's not addressing symbolic culture specifically. They're talking about how we interpret the variation in the African archaeological record throughout the Middle Stone Age, and they do a good job of that, showing local trajectories. They cite Dapchaukas's pigment paper, but they totally ignore its main conclusion because they're not interested in the possibility of qualitative change, when quantity changes in quantity become changes in quality. They don't actually, I don't think they hardly use the word symbolism. They don't use the term symbolic culture. So
why do we think symbolism is necessarily revolutionary in terms of social, political context? Because they're really talking about cultural evolution without any gender politics, without any kind of political angle to it. But what are they missing there? They're obviously reliable in their discussion of the archaeological evidence. But what are they missing? Chris, you can also help if you want.
Yeah. I mean, basically, archaeologists tend to ignore symbolic culture because they think, oh, we can't infer meanings. We can't. That's way beyond our pay rate.
They're just giving up.
Yeah. They I mean, you could take a more cynical view of it and say they know where it leads. If they go down the Oka record, and particularly now with this Dapchaukas paper, I mean, Chris would be probably better addressing this.
Yeah, go for it. Well, Chris, why is symbolic culture necessarily revolutionary?
Well, in 1975, an anthropologist called Dan Sperber wrote a lovely short book for which he got all sorts of prizes called Rethinking Symbolism. And he was describing his field work, and I won't go into it all, but it was in Ethiopia, wasn't it? And yes, he was told all sorts of things, which he thought, okay, that's fair enough. I mean, about how they garden, how they sometimes hunt, how they look after their animals and stuff. And he just said he sort of made notes, but he wasn't all that interested. But when he was told that all the leopards in the area were Christians, he picked up his ears. Oh, the leopards are Christians. That's really strange. And in this part of the world, if you're a Christian, when you slaughter an animal, you throw it to one side, and it has to be to the left side. I think I'm right in saying, can't remember the detail. And so Sperber said, "Oh, you mean to me the leopards, when they kill an animal, they always throw it to the left side?" And then he was told, yes, they do. And I won't go into it all, but he ended up with his field notes saying, they tell us things that it's not symbolic. And the reason he thinks it's not symbolic is because, well, it's like a no-brainer. It's obviously true. But when he hears something which just can't be true, I mean, Christian leopards, how can leopards be Christian? he came, it must be symbolic. And so he came to a wonderful definition of symbolism. Anything which is obviously not true, but everyone believes it, that's symbolism. If it, so symbolism are things which can't be true, but everyone believes them, and so they kind of are true in the sense that they're part of religion or some system which isn't not sort of physically true, but true in some higher sort of sense, institutionally true, we would perhaps say these days. So anyway, the critical point is that monkeys and apes don't do all that stuff. They're very keen on when they hear the signal and knowing that it's true. So a dominant chimp go make a pantoot, and that's evidence that this particular chimp is getting quite aroused. And a signal from an animal which isn't true it won't be welcomed by anybody else in the group. So all animal signals are kind of true. In a sense, they're symptoms. Perhaps a little bit too simple to say the symptoms, but the costly signaling of animals is evidence of the truth of those signals. But in language, everything we say is how do you know it's true? It's like words are cheap. Why do you believe them? And the critical point is, I'll end on this, is that for symbolism to work, there has to be an extraordinary amount of in-group trust, such that even if you know it's not true, you're still interested in what it says about what people are thinking, fantasizing, remembering, dreaming, and so on and so forth. So everything in symbolism is false, but but we have sufficient in-group trust to take it that the person giving us that false information isn't lying. They're trying to tell us something about another level of reality, which is the level of shared fiction, shared imaginations, hopes, dreams, remembrances, and so forth. And animals just don't do that. And a short way of saying that is to say animals don't have symbolic culture, they don't have language, they don't have religion, they don't know art, all those things which are kind of fake. But we humans, we're more interested in those sort of things than we are in reality. No one ever died for a table or a chair or something, but people die for flags. So things which are symbolic are more important in many ways than things which are true.
So to enter this world of shared imagination, the symbolic domain, in some sense, we need to overthrow the brute world, the world of brute reality. And in doing that, that is a kind of political revolution of overthrowing dominance relations themselves, that any one animal is going to be able to dominate by force, because all the other individuals are able to gang up against any one that threatens to dominate by force. It's perhaps worth mentioning Christopher Boehm's ideas there. So this is about reverse dominance, not just counter dominance of one-on-one relationships. So we think that we can't talk about the symbolic revolution without also entailing a social revolution, which entails a very significant egalitarianism and definitely a gender egalitarianism. So we'd argue language is itself a key indicator of the egalitarianism of our ancestors, that we couldn't have evolved language without it. Does that make sense? And do we have questions? Because we've said quite a lot, but people may be...
Well, does Ian want to talk to how red ochre was procured in geographical areas where it didn't occur naturally? And I have a follow-up question to that. And then there's also a question from Peter in the chat.
Yeah. Very late in the day, I finally most of my research had been in Southern Africa, where you've got abundant outcrops of red ochre and it's abundant in the archaeological record. But what about Central Africa, and in particular in the Congo Basin, where rock outcrops of any kind are few and far between, and there's virtually no record of ochre use. And when I started looking at the ritual use of red substances amongst forest hunter-gatherers, what we found is that they're using a redwood Pterocarpus soyalxi in exactly the same way as East African and Southern African populations were using red ochre. But that's, for the moment at least, not going to be archaeologically detectable. But presumably that pattern that we see in Dapshalkas's maps of Africa, where we saw the ochre record, we can substitute ochre for redwood throughout Western Africa, certainly throughout the late Pleistocene.
I mean, the other way around, substitute redwood for ochre.
Either way, yeah.
I know what you mean. Yeah, it fills in the gap so that this would have been a Pan-African phenomenon, because we know people were likely in the forests, but they wouldn't have had ochre, they would have had other substances.
And in the Kalahari, which is slightly similar, but they do have some ochre sources there. So particularly in the Western Kalahari, you find people using both, almost interchangeably.
Great. There is a good question there. Stephanie, did you want to ask the question, or if
I'm okay if you read it.
you're happy? Okay. So Stephanie's asking about ritual as a category and symbolism. We're saying humans are unique in symbolism. What about the rituals that animals have? Okay. Chris, do you want to deal with that? Or
You're the expert, Camilla.
okay. Yeah, this is a very, very good question, because there is a lot of animal rituals, or what I would call ritualized behavior. Somebody else is making noise. Could you quiet so we've got single channel? Thank you. So there is a lot of ritualized behavior with animals. Chris was just talking about, and Ian was mentioning, what are known as costly signals. So animal ritualized behaviors, we can think of mating behaviors like a couple of ibex antelope going head to head, bashing each other, or red deer with their horns. Or red deer doing roaring to demonstrate their size. This kind of ritualized. There are many other types of ritualized behaviors. Many of them are sexually selected, but there are also ritualized behaviors between prey animals and predators, where prey animals, the famous pronking behaviors of gazelles and impalas, when they get spotted by a lion or a wolf, a predator, they, instead of running away, they jump up and down in the spot. And you think, why are they doing that? Well, why don't they run away? But the reason they're doing that is they're using what Chris said. They're using reliable, hard to fake signals to show to the predator that they are super fit. And if they're super fit, predator, go and chase somebody else. Don't chase me, chase somebody else. So that signaling actually serves the purpose for the animal that's the prey, because they don't have to run away. And it serves the purpose for the predator, because that predator doesn't want to chase the fastest, fittest animal. The predator wants to go after the sicker animal. So there's a kind of signaling communication happening between even different species, prey and predator. And many, many examples in sexual selection with signaling between males and females and so forth. But what we say about it is that these rituals, if we call them rituals for animals, they are hard to fake, they are costly, and they completely deal with this world of reality. They're known as indexical signals, because the animals are demonstrating with some behavior which is an index of their actual fitness, or some quality that they possess. So it's really within the real world. Whereas when we're talking about human ritual, and Ian could tell us so much about Khoisan people's rituals with ochre and pigments, they are invoking supernatural concepts. They are invoking another world. So humans are collectively imagining another world or traveling to that other world in the course of the rituals. The rituals may be costly. Perhaps you could tell something about the Elan bull dance as a kind of a key archetypal ritual for a girl's first menstruation. But the Elan bull dance, which is danced a number of days around a girl in a menstrual hut, where there may indeed be use of red ochre passed around the women who are celebrating that occasion, they will be invoking a supernatural entity of Eland that is summoned by the girls' presence and the dance, with special song, special music, and the girl, through the power of her blood, is able to carry the community into the other world, which is known for the Jinpasi as first creation, a kind of time beyond time where nothing is fixed, everything is changing. It's a kind of dreaming for the Jinpasi. So we really distinguish between animal rituals. There is continuity from animal rituals into human rituals, but we also distinguish human rituals for this collective sharing of concepts of the other world. It's entering a virtual shared domain, a domain of virtual reality. We have no evidence at all for any other species doing that or referencing any virtual reality. Is that enough? Can we do?
That's such a thorough answer. Thank you. It really helps me.
Thank you. But it's a great question because it gives us an evolutionary continuity between stuff that animals do and stuff that humans do. So I think it's important. And have we got any more questions for some of the?
Could you just come back a bit on David's question about the costs of ochre procurement? I was talking at a sort of massive landscape scale, comparing Congo and Kalahari with Southern and Eastern Africa. But of course, even within Southern and Eastern Africa, there are going to be some places where you don't have local ochre outcrops. And what we're beginning to see, because it's only in the last 10 years really that it's become possible to source where ochres were coming from. And there's preliminary evidence that from very early on, at some sites, people were going to considerable costs to procure high quality ochres. I have in mind, I mean, they haven't done a proper sourcing study yet, but I think there's very good circumstantial evidence that a site called Border Cave in KwaZulu-Natal, which goes back 250,000 years, right from the beginning, the earliest pieces of ochre there are certainly not from the local environment. And the most likely source is going to be over 100 kilometers away. And so I think this speaks to this point about the costliness of early group rituals. It is part of the way of displaying those costs, that you go to all this effort to get the best quality pigments. And of course, we know this ethnographically, that the classic example is in Australia, where parties of men would go for many weeks on ochre procurement trips, involving round trips of 500 kilometers.
Of course, I mean, it's important to remember, and this is Ian's work, of course, that we think of mining for precious metals, mining for gold, mining for diamonds. The first super valuable, precious substance mined for at great, great expense, was this ochre, which had to be as near as possible to blood red. And on the subject of costly signaling, and of course, in any cosmetics, when you think about the first uses of silver, the first uses of gold, the first uses of diamonds that archaeologists discover, you don't want to be wearing something which looks like it was bought in some cheap store. You want to, the whole point is to look costly. The whole point is to wear stuff which is gold, silver, diamonds, to show that you're not cheap. And so the costliness is part of its, part of the display. In some areas you want to be quick and efficient with things, but not when you're putting on your adornments. They need to look costly and be costly in a hard to fake way. And if it's quite clear the ochre wasn't some bit of mud sort of picked up around the corner, it took all this effort to get there, of course the women value it far, 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 far more, because the last thing women want to look like in their coalition is cheap. That is the opposite of what you want to look like. You want to look really, really costly, hard to get, and all those things, because that's part of your pride, your value, self-esteem, and the rest of it.
We also emphasize, whereas some evolutionary psychology arguments posit that women using ornamentation, makeup, and so on are kind of competing with each other, and therefore feminists take a very dim view sometimes of cosmetics as something that may undermine female solidarity. When it comes to this indigenous ritual use of cosmetics, these are highly collectivized occasions that women are sharing, women are using they're demonstrating their solidarity with the cosmetics. It's not a matter of individuals at loggerheads with each other. It's a matter of demonstration of their alliance in the ritual, that their cosmetics are displaying this. So we don't want to lose sight of that female cosmetic coalition principle. It's very much a collective.
I just wanted to say, Camille, I don't know what you think of this, but I've got here on my phone a little snippet of Ingrid Lewis among the Bengeli, illustrating what's going on in these rituals. I mean, in the past we call them sex strike. I mean, if you're all beautifully adorned and you're all as a whole bunch of women proving that you really are very, 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 very desirable, but on the other hand pretty hard to get. One way of describing all that is that you're not, at least periodically, certainly when a girl's menstruating and she's been treasured by all her guardians and female companions, you're periodically, one word I use in my book, Blood Relations, is on strike, which means no sex until you men behave, and as Ian was saying, go away and get find a zebra, find an animal, and come back with it to camp, and we'll think about it. Can I play this, Camilla? Is it just?
Try it out. I mean, some people might get it's very interesting. Yeah.
Well, let me just explain.
And then perhaps we could go in the direction that Helen was suggesting, towards the matriarchy stories and towards why do men take over the signals? What happens with gender relations?
This little clip is about 2 minutes. That's all, and it doesn't illustrate anything. Doesn't illustrate anything that Ian's been talking about. Doesn't illustrate ochre and so on. But it does. What's interesting is it does illustrate that in a very egalitarian hunter-gatherer society, things aren't sort of perfect. The young lads can be extremely insulting and sexist, and of course the girls as well.
Girls can be extremely insulting and sexist.
That's right. It's just that because you have one coalition sort of fighting another, the men in a way ritually and playfully, boosting their solidarity and muscular power and everything else, showing off that they're men. But that would get a bit boring and a bit intolerable if the men outstayed their welcome. The women do it as well. So I just wanted to. I'm hoping this will work. It's just so brilliant.
So when we visited Mbenje in 2019, the women danced Ngoku, which was, after a wonderful festival, followed by the young men dancing Sho, which is sort of a display of masculinity and testosterone, I would say. So the young boys were running up and down the camp, and they were insulting girls' vaginas, calling them too big, calling them holes, and insulting them as not being hot, as not being tight, and all sorts of things. And the women grew more and more angry. The boys also smashed a bottle that they had against a tree and continued to insult the girls' vaginas and women's vaginas. And then an elder woman stood up. She spat on the floor and she said in a very loud voice, "Take your vaginas, get up, and let's get out of here. We are leaving them to copulate with mapombe. We are leaving them to their mapombe." Now, mapombe is a forest fruit that is hard on the outside and has a soft center. And in their creation myth, it was said that the men copulated with these fruits to have baby boys. So the women got up, actually. Quite a few girls also were very angry. And then an elder man came towards this old lady. And he bowed in front of her. And he pointed to her womb. And he said to her, "Sundake moi," which means diminish the fire in your belly, your anger. We do know, pointing to her and her womb, that life begins only in you.
Wow.
What's going on? Sorry,
Did it stop? That was it, wasn't it?
I don't know what that silly noise is.
Never mind. But that was it, wasn't it? That was the
Yes, it's just that's an example of a collective withdrawal of sex because men were misbehaving, and it's just
sort them out.
just sort them out. That's the way to do it. And of course, once the elderly man had bowed before in a way the matriarch, you know, the elderly woman who took control at that point, then everyone sort of calmed down and the dispute was over. But it's just so nice that because nobody's saying that in a hunter-gatherer society, everyone's all being politically correct and everyone's behaving themselves and everybody's being respectful and stuff. I mean, you know, boys are boys, girls are girls. You're not going to get that. But as long as each side has roughly got the same, you know, ability to fight each other, and it's kind of playful at the end of the day, and violence is absolutely outlawed, and that is a fact. There's no way if those boys had used any violence against a woman, they would have absolutely. That would, you know, that would be the end of it. So I just thought it was a beautiful example.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Of sex strike. I mean, I call it sex strike. Those when that woman said, "Right, take your vaginas away," they're going to have to copulate.
That sounds like a sex strike
to me. That sounds like a strike action.
Yeah. And total gender solidarity. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
I've just got that out of Ingrid the other day. I was just around at Jerome's place in Brixton, and I just thought, waiting for Ingrid to write it up in a book or something. I'll long be dead before it gets out there.
Just say a little who are Jerome and Ingrid, because not everyone will know.
I'll say, okay, so Jerome Lewis and Ingrid Lewis, a couple who had children out in the Congo. So they've done more, I would say, probably more non-stop field work in a gender egalitarian forest hunter-gatherer society than I think it's true to say than anyone else. And so if you really want to know, I don't know, what it feels like to live in a society which is genuinely free, genuinely communistic, where everybody's sharing and life is just so joyful, everyone's singing, I don't know, they can tell you how it all works. It's like, you know, the way I think of it is they've been to the future, and in the sense that if humanity has the future, we'll have to get back to something like that. They've been to the future and it works. And you know, and it's they're still. Mona went to the same. Mona Finnegan, who's speaking here later on.
Mona will be coming next month and the month after. Yes,
she did field work in the same region. And just to say, what you have is you have a matriarchy. Ngoku it was just after Ngoku that this incident that Ingrid was talking about happened. So when the women of stormed into the camp, all looking very sexy, taunting, deriding the men, making fun of their parts, making poor, saying they're no good in bed and all that stuff. And the men have to put up with all these insults. And it goes on for a while, and then everything settles down. And then the men think, okay, right, we're going to show what we're going to strut our stuff, and they do their stomping and showing all their muscles and stuff. And then so what you get the women's rule, and then the men's rule. So you get matriarchy, but only for a while, and then you get patriarchy, but only for a while. Each camp makes sure that the others don't overdo it. So the matriarchy will last for a week or 10 days, and then the patriarchy will last for a week or 10 days. And Morna Finnegan had this wonderful description of it all, and she ended up calling it communism in motion. It's like, when you've got communism, don't just sit back and think, okay, everything's perfect. Each side is going to be pretty vigilant to make sure that things don't go pear-shaped, and you have to sort of fight your corner. And in a way, what happens is that the human revolution is endlessly, deliberately lost and then regained, and lost and regained. And we in RAG think that would have been on a lunar basis. Roughly every dark moon, you would have won the revolution, and every full moon, you kind of lost it on purpose, but that's fine, because then you have lots of sex, and it's okay as long as you win the revolution again next new moon, next dark moon.
Can we just in the last little bit think about this matriarchy myth phenomenon, because there's so many traditional stories, including from egalitarian hunter-gatherers, including that Mapombe story that women originally had. In the Mapombe story, it's a story about how women originally held Ejengi, who now is the spirit belonging to men. And with the Hadza, women originally held Epeme. But you have other examples of matriarchy myths from various parts of the world, which keep making this claim that women, first of all, had the power. What about these stories? What do they mean? What do they cast attention, or what do they say about matriarchy versus patriarchy?
That will hopefully answer Helen's question about what happens when men do take over. And what happens when men do take over in the first instance is that because menstruation is the only way you can signal that you've got sacred power, sort of cosmic power. When men take over, and the men want to signal, we have cosmic power, we have sacred power, guess what? The men have to menstruate. And at first sight, that seems, okay, well, how can that happen? But actually, men can menstruate, sort of, if they've got a sharp shell or a stone to cut the boys as they come of age and make them bleed. And then what happens is that the men repeat in their own ritual a whole girl's first menstruation ceremony, but this time with the boys. And in fact, when the men stop doing these things and menstruating collectively to assert their power, they do it in a menstrual hut. But of course, it's now turned into what they call a men's house. Now, don't think, please, that these are sort of strange little aberrations which happen in different parts of the world. It's far, far more important than that. In every part of the world where men, in a hunting-gathering society or a society which has moved to gardening, in every part of the world where the men monopolize ritual power, they will not think of it as natural. There's no idea that, like anything like the Western idea, where in the West we tend to think, oh, male dominance is natural. No. Men think the exact opposite. They think that it's the natural thing, because women have menstrual cycles and therefore they can connect up with each other and through the moon, and it might be called witchcraft or something. Women's bodies are made for supernatural power, and men find it really difficult. They've got to artificially try to menstruate, and they know it's not really the same thing, but they make an effort. But everything the men do to have power is intentionally and consciously copying what women do. And so the first men's houses, which are quite clearly they're the first churches, the first mosques, the first temples, they're menstrual houses. And it's not just me saying that, the men themselves say it. So, Camilla, have I got time to read out this? There's a story here. Do you want the?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Okay, so this is from the Selknam Ona, Tierra del Fuego, the origin of the Hain. The Hain is this ritual ceremony, rather like a Ejengi, of the Benjedi, through which men assert we have the power. In the beginning, witchcraft was known only by the women. They practiced it in a lodge, which no man dared approach. The girls, as they came of age, were instructed in the magic arts, learning how to bring sickness and death to those who displease them. Sickness and death means if a menstruated girl just looks at the man, that's he can turn to stone or something like that. It's witchcraft. The men lived in abject fear and subjection. Certainly they had bows and arrows with which to hunt, yet they asked, what use are such weapons against witchcraft? The tyranny of women. Don't forget, this is a men's myth. The men are justifying their monopoly of ritual power. So of course they turn the tables completely and make up a ridiculous story about tyranny. The tyranny of women bore down more and more heavily, until at last one day the men resolved to fight back. They decided to kill the women, whereupon there ensued a great massacre, from which not one woman escaped in human form. The men spared their little daughters and waited until these had grown old enough to become wives, and so that these women should never be able to band together and regain their old ascendancy, the men inaugurated a secret society of their own and banished forever the Women's Lodge, in which so many wicked plots had been hatched. Well, in my book, I've got about 50 of these stories. The kind of variations of a theme from Africa, from Amazonia, from all over the place. And it's just so clear that the original form of, if you like, religious power, almost like royal sovereignty actually, was as a result of women asserting their power, the power of their blood in a hut once a month. And so when men did take over, the grammar of ritual potency was not something they could change. They had to almost like pretend to be doing what women used to do, while meanwhile, of course, forbidding women from doing it. So once men claim that their menstruation and their childbirth is powerful and beautiful and creative, they then describe women's menstruation as polluting, dangerous, harmful, etc. Now that's rather one-sided, because of course in all these societies the women have their own alternative version, but increasingly over history the men's version began to sort of take over, because unless women could sort of rise up once a month and establish their potency, the system wouldn't work. It had to be the periodicity had to be that of women's own bodies and the moon. When you just get a sort of a carnival, Feast of Fools once a year, and the rest of the year is male dominated, that isn't so good.
So you're saying that losing a lunar type of rhythm in favor of a seasonal, very strongly seasonal rhythm, which would of course occur with farming and horticulture and pastoralism tendencies, would have been the reasons for that sort of shift.
Yes, that's right. Hunter-gatherers, and Ian's done some marvelous, brilliant work on this. Hunter-gatherers in the critical period of human evolution, the emergence of modern Homo sapiens, hunted by the moon. So a collective big game hunt would have been a once a month event. And that corresponded perfectly to the fact that women could send the men out to hunt by just, refusing sex during the menstrual period on a once a month basis. And by the way, all the rock art calendars and stuff tell us that lunar time was, critical. But with agriculture, you can't sow the seeds and reap the harvest once a month. It takes a year. So seasonality takes over, and that's why in the myths there's the transition from matriarchy to patriarchy is depicted as the destruction of the moon's power, or the subordination of the moon to the new power, which is the power of the sun. So you get the sun gods, the sun chiefs, the sun man, all over the place. You get the sun triumphing over the moon, just as men triumph over women.
So we are actually believing at face value what the indigenous stories claim, that there really is truth to those stories.
As I say, when the men say we stole these secrets from women, namely, when we cut our penises or our nose or nosebleed, whatever it is you do is to prove that you're initiated. And it always involves blood, by the way. And the men always say that this is menstrual blood. They always say that in one way or the other. When men say we are robbing women of the power which is theirs by menstruating and giving birth, because of course they have to, all this thing about being twice born, what the idea is, women just give birth to flesh. Well, babies need to grow up and have a soul. So the priest has to come in, the men have to come in and give birth to the baby all over again. But I'm simply saying, when men say we stole these secrets from women, I believe them, because they're not talking about the distant prehistoric past. They're talking about what they're doing in the here and now. They are stealing women's power and trying to monopolize it for themselves. They're doing it. So I believe them. And I don't really understand why on earth the anthropologists don't take these stories that seriously. And in fact, the fact that they don't take those stories seriously, in my view, is shameful. It's absolutely shameful. It's just one more example of the way in which indigenous knowledge is disregarded. It's disgraceful. Those men know what they're doing, and you can argue that perhaps they had to do it. I mean, it's hard to know how they could have survived, if the game scarce, if there's all sorts of reasons why you have to make a transition to to gardening and agriculture. But to me, these stories are a version of truth. They shouldn't be dismissed. Obviously the ideology, when the men say, oh, the women were tyrannizing us, we're all scared and upset, that's nonsense. We know from the work of Jerome and Ingrid that happened to the Bidjeli. The women, yes, they sort of tyrannize the men, but it's playful. The women, they come onto they take over the camp. They're strutting their stuff. And the men, the men are a bit embarrassed and they feel a bit uncomfortable, but they put up with it. To call that a kind of tyranny, but of course, when the men take over and impose a real tyranny, including all kinds of sanctions in some areas, where you get severe patriarchy, sanctions like gang rape and stuff, and I have to say that no question that sort of thing did happen. Then the men justify their very unpleasant behaviour by saying, well, we're only doing to the women what they used to do to us. And by the way, there's no other even attempted explanation to explain why it is that men menstruate. I mean, it's well known that they do. It's well known that subincision is a form of male menstruation, and nose bleeding, all these things. But apart from our explanation, which is that it's true, what they say, they're stealing stuff from women, the Western anthropologists, they decide it's a bit difficult to answer the question, a bit uncomfortable, so let's ignore it.
I forgot. Did that help your question, Helen? Did we want to expand on that?
No, it absolutely did, and I'm always just struck by how much that story shows up everywhere in the world in a pretty consistent fashion. And agree with Chris that it speaks to the truth, and it's baffling why it's not been examined some more. I remember when I was doing some research for the talk I gave, The Civilizing Influence, that theme came up over and over and over again. And I kind of shunted it aside because I was like, this is interesting, but I don't know if I want to wade into this right now, but it's probably something that...
Can I just say, hey, thank you so much. But to me, when those initiated men tell their upside down stories about things, they started a thing called education, which is still going on. To me, the world's universities, which used to be theological colleges and all sorts of, to me, the whole education system is, even to this day, designed to conceal from women one very important thing, which is the women's own intrinsic power. So make sure that women are afraid of their own power and won't go there, particularly when it's around menstruation and childbirth. Make sure that the idea that women can derive power from being women, that is absolutely illegitimate. And so what those initiated men in Australia and places set up, a kind of education system called initiation, to me, it's still around.
Yeah.
And a lot of this.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Camilla. But just a lot of the stories also involve, like you said, really demonizing what the women would do with the power and making it seem like, you know, it was just not right that that kind of knowledge and power would be in the hands of women. And I think that's that fear you're talking about, the fact that this was drilled into, you know, the men and into the women to say, you know, for you to know these things, for you to be able to do these things is dangerous, and we need to be watchers over that. It's pretty crazy, but yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks.
No, thank you.
Your words,
you.
Helen, mean a lot to me. What you just said means a lot to me.
Yeah, I think it would be nice to try and get another series together, which is focused quite a lot on the folklore and the stories, and tries to address some of this in more detail.
So many of these stories have one way or the other is called a monster. It's some kind of, it's a snake or some other kind of monster,
Yeah.
or a cannibalistic female of some sort. And yeah, so it's just so clear that these patriarchs, they produce a monstrous image of the human female. The human female, especially if she's collective, becomes the dragon, the snake, the one or other sort of monster. And you know, the world has to be made safe from the monster, and therefore you have to slay the monster. You have to cut off its head. Usually it's got lots of heads, this monster. You've got to cut them all off. And it's perfectly clear to me that that monster is a false image of female coalitions. The monster is the monster of matrilineal kinship. That's why it's many-headed, because as Sarah Hrdy pointed out, children should be, or were, and ought to be in the future, looked after by lots of mothers. And patriarchy was always worried about lots of mothers, especially if they banded together. And so you had to chop their heads off. And it was a bit difficult thing, but these St. Georges and people who slay a dragon, what they're doing is they're making the world safe for marriage, you know, patriarchal marriage, where a woman is like the property of the man and he's got conjugal rights over her. They're making, by slaying the dragon, and they make the world safe for marriage, private property, the family, and patriarchy.
What has always baffled me is how even in matrilineal societies where rules of inheritance and, you know, how families link up and connect with each other and share resources is based on connections to mothers, how this patriarchal dominant mindset still finds its way into the fabric of society. I was reading a paper yesterday about depictions of women in folklore, and this was a discussion of Lunda folklore, and the Lunda are a very matrilineal society, but then you look even at the proverbs and the stories, they still paint these pictures that limit women, you know, only to the sphere of being a wife and being a mother. But when it starts venturing out of that sphere, it becomes dangerous to be a woman in any way, shape, or form. So kind of taking what works, but then not allowing the full manifestation of it to come through, because then it would destabilize the patriarchal framework.
Yeah, we're just starting to talk about a very big subject there. And the question of, because it is certainly not true that every matrilineal society gives women very high status necessarily. It may also operate as status for men. But in general, principles of matrilineal will probably give women significant autonomy, comparative to principles of patrilineal at least. But you're very right about ideologies like the Lunda, which they're after all ideologies that come from states, the foundation of states and kingship, which, yeah, so there's a deep history with these myths to discuss, I'd say, and we almost surely need another series to start talking about all that, where we could look at some of your work as well. Would be really great.
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
what would be lovely would be to hear some of your stories.
Yeah,
Helen,
the research.
how you've been affected by them, and
Yeah,
how they affect you as a woman. It'd be
Yeah.
brilliant to have a talk by you on all that.
yeah.
Absolutely.
No, we need to set some of that up.
I mean, obviously, what's been so horribly missing is that so much of this stuff has been done by people over here, mostly white people, and perhaps even mostly men like me. And it's about time we heard your voice and others like it, Helen. We really do need that. It's such a breath of fresh air for me to hear you speak in that way.
No, thank you. And thanks to RAG, because a lot of the questions I have and insights I get while reading the myths, which might just be stories, but the cultural underpinnings of these stories come from my exposure to the work that you folks do. So thank you in return.
Well, it's mutual because you've thrown a lot of light for us as well in so much of the African folklore as well. And you've done some beautiful talks for us. I don't know, we're probably going to need to wind up for this evening because we've reached time. Can I ask Darsha, if Darsha's here, has she just gone, to say hello, because Darsha's going to come, going to be one of our lead. Hi, do you want to say hello, Darsha? Because we're going to have you and your work featuring next time, which will be May the 20th. And maybe you could just say a tiny bit, just to say hi and just whatever.
Hello, everybody. Wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Ellen and Chris and Ian and Camilla. It's just beautiful. My contribution will be to examine what does it mean to raise children cooperatively, cooperative breeding? What are the actual characteristics of that? And how does that influence brain development? That's kind of my area. And our capacities as human beings. We've lost a lot of that child rearing, those practices that we evolved to have. And now we can map what goes wrong. So I'm going to kind of focus there and probably suggest and speculate on other things, like the brain, our jaws have been shrinking from the lack of breastfeeding in the last hundreds of years, which creates all sorts of sleep problems, which Westerners are having all over the place, and orthodontic problems. So that's quite interesting, I think, to pay attention to that aspect of the skull as well as a brain case.
Wow.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
Thank you. So next time is going to be thinking about with Darsha's work central, did cooperative childcare make us human? And we're going to bring as well Mona Finnegan with her work and observations on the Ebengele, the egalitarian hunter-gatherer people that we've heard about a bit tonight, with her experience of exposure to typical Ebengele collective childcare. And so that should be a really interesting session. So I hope everybody who's joined us tonight will be able to come back on that occasion. And please sign up on Eventbrite for that. I don't think it's all sold out at this stage. But if you've got the links for tonight, they will be the same links again in 4 weeks' time. So you can use those again. So thank you so much to Helen for facilitating, and Ian and Chris and everybody for joining us. And everybody's, I think that's going to be it for tonight.
I have could I talk to Chris Knight for a couple of minutes before we hang up?
Okay, all right. So I'm going to.
If you want to do that, yeah.
Let's go. I'm closing the meeting without closing it. I'm not going to press the button. Those of you who want to hang around, obviously, it's nothing private really, but anyway. Okay, go on.
This is
Thanks, everyone.
This is completely a shot in the dark. One of my favorite aunties raised her family in Uganda, ending with the Amin dictatorship. She was a close friend of Dian Fossey.
Yeah.
And shortly before she died, my aunt told me, she said they used to go to dinner together occasionally. The last time they had dinner, she said, Diane said to her she was worried about her gorillas because they were being pushed farther up the mountain and they could no longer grow garlic and their babies were getting sick. I've never heard that anywhere else. I've never been able to substantiate it. So I just, since you're an expert in primates, I thought I would.
Well, actually,
put it in there.
I'm not a field working primatologist at all. Everything I've got is got from other, colleagues and books and stuff. But of course, the great apes have very sophisticated medicine chests. And I did sort of supervise one of my students, Andrew Fowler, who's studying that, and some other people are studying that as well, with Vokasama, the primatologist, who's a close friend of ours. So I'm not at all surprised that these mountain gorillas were using wild garlic. I don't quite know what other observation to make. I can't say anything too intelligent, really.
That's
But I mean-
fascinating. Capuchin monkeys are also known to have a very wide range of medicine treatments as well. And of course, chimps. So there are many of them.
Well, what she was saying concerned cultivation, which is what hooked me.
Oh, I see. I didn't get
But you
that.
try to say they're farming the garlic.
They actually were growing garlic, and
Okay.
in the context of some work that I'm doing now for the past 10 years, it strikes me that if they find a loaded firearm, they're not going to learn to shoot people or form armies or anything. I mean, it's not like some leap of development is going to happen, but there's something back in there where there's this possibility.
Can I just get this clear? Diane Fossey was telling your aunt that the mountain gorillas were growing.
Farming garlic.
Said they were unable to grow their garlic
They're unable
at
to grow
higher
garlic.
altitudes.
Oh my God.
I see. Sorry. I wasn't listening.
Didn't get that bit.
That's critical. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
Diane Fossey should have known, but I mean, I suppose the thing to find out is whether, I mean, there's now, those mountain gorillas are doing kind of okay, I gather, aren't they? They've been increasing their population in the last 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
It should be possible to find out whether they actually grow the.
It's very notable that those mountain gorillas have a lot of flexibility. They've been adjusting considerably in their social grouping to the situation of warfare and the situations they've been coming across. It's very remarkable, their flexibility, actually.
Well, thank you very much. This was fascinating. I'm very concerned about the imminent extinction, possibly of life itself.
We all are.
And the more I get into it, I can't write fast enough to keep up with the acceleration now. But I'm zeroing in on the possibility that human beings can make a cultural leap into a new way of being, which will be restorative instead of destructive to the planet.
Well, I today have just been up in London with an Extinction Rebellion demonstration, a really lovely festival with my kids and grandkids. It was very, very big in around Parliament here in London today. I would say there's probably ended up with being 70,000-80,000 people. So I'm really with you on that, and I think everyone has the right to be scared, but somehow we've got to not spread panic if panic means people sort of give up. So somehow or other we've got to stay not optimistic about what will happen if we don't do things, but optimistic about our ability somehow at the last very moment to, as you say, manage to work some extraordinary revolution. I suppose partly based, on knowledge that it was through a revolution, perhaps rather similar kind of revolution in at least some formal senses, because there were all sorts of climate threats, as Ian's well aware of in the past as we became human. So I
Well, thank you so much. It's a very long conversation.
yeah.
Okay.
I think we better go. And hopefully see you next moon. We're trying to organize things on a monthly lunar basis. Absolutely, because talking about things isn't enough. We've got to start doing them. So that's why this particular series is moon scheduled.
Saturday
excellent.
new moon. The new moon, the Saturday and the new moon is the time.
Yeah. Okay, everybody. So see you all next time, next moon.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Dancia. Thanks.